The moment her father called her worthless in front of the entire court, the Alpha King set his iron crown at her feet. She was Verity, the kennel-hand, the quiet girl who smelled of straw and hound musk. He was Thane, the wolf king of the north, a man forged in war and silence, whose very presence could freeze the marrow in a man's bones. A king did not look at a kennel-hand, and a father did not discard his own blood like refuse. But what no one in that hall understood, least of all her father, was that the king was not the only one listening, and for the first time in a century, his wolf was paying attention. If you believe that being truly seen can change your entire world, type "worthy" below and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know about the silence. Verity lived in a world of it. Not the peaceful silence of a forest at dawn, but the heavy, deliberate silence of being overlooked. She was the third child of Lord Valerius, an alpha whose pride was as vast and as cold as the northern mountains his hold was carved into. Her two older brothers were shifters of formidable strength, their wolves broad-shouldered and fierce, a mirror of their father. They were loud, and they were seen. Verity was not. She had never shifted. The wolf that should have been a second skin to her remained a sleeping thing, a faint echo in her blood that never answered her call. For this, her father deemed her broken. A failure. Her world was the kennels. The stone-flagged floors were cold even in summer, and the air was thick with the honest scents of hound and hay and leather. Here the silence was different. It was a comfortable quiet, filled with the soft panting of the great wolfhounds, the rustle of straw as they settled, the gentle thump of a tail against the floor. The hounds did not care that she was a girl without a wolf. They only knew the kindness in her hands and the low, soothing murmur of her voice. She was their sanctuary, and they, in turn, were hers. She knew each of them by name, by temperament, by the unique texture of the fur behind their ears. There was Bryn, the old matriarch with cloudy eyes, and Tor, the young pup who was all paws and clumsy energy. She dressed their wounds, cleaned their coats, and sat with them for hours, her small back pressed against the warm, breathing flank of a beast twice her size. It was here, among the hounds, that she felt whole. The news of the Alpha King's arrival had sent a tremor through the entire hold. King Thane was a name spoken in hushed, reverent tones. He was the victor of the border wars, the alpha of alphas, who had united the fractured northern packs through sheer will and brutal strength. He was a man said to have a heart of winter stone, a ruler who had not been seen to smile since his coronation a decade ago. His visit was not one of pleasantries. It was a tour of his domain, a stark reminder to his bannermen of where their fealty lay. Lord Valerius, desperate to impress, had spent weeks preparing. The great hall was scrubbed, new tapestries were hung, and the kitchens were in a state of controlled chaos. Verity's brothers swaggered about, preening in their new leathers, eager to be seen by the legendary warrior king. Verity was meant to be invisible. Her father had made his orders clear. She was to remain in the kennels, out of sight. "I will not have the king see my shame," he'd snarled, his eyes sweeping over her with familiar disgust. The words were old wounds, calloused over but still aching with a dull, constant throb. She had simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor, and retreated to the only place she felt she belonged. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. On the night of the great feast, a commotion erupted from the courtyard. Shouts echoed off the stone walls, followed by the deep, savage snarl of a cornered animal. Verity's heart leaped into her throat. She recognized that sound. It was not the bark of a common holdhound. It was deeper, wilder. She slipped out of the kennels, her worn tunic a gray shadow against the torchlit walls. In the center of the yard, surrounded by a ring of nervous guards, was the largest wolfhound she had ever seen. Its coat was the color of storm clouds, its eyes a burning, frantic gold. A heavy chain, snapped at one link, dangled from its thick leather collar. This was no holdhound. This was a war-hound, the king's own. The animal, whose name she would later learn was Fen, was bleeding from a gash on its flank, likely from catching itself on a loose nail or splintered gate. Fear and pain had driven it to a primal frenzy. It lunged at any guard who dared approach, its teeth bared in a terrifying display. "Get a crossbow!" one of the guards yelled. "It's gone mad! We'll have to put it down before it savages someone." "No!" The word was torn from Verity's throat before she could stop it. Every head turned to her. She saw her father standing on the steps of the great hall, his face a mask of incandescent fury. Beside him, a figure stood in absolute stillness, a man whose presence seemed to consume the very air around him. Alpha King Thane. He was even more imposing than the legends claimed. Tall and broad-shouldered, clad in black leather and dark furs, he seemed carved from the mountain itself. His face was hard, etched with lines of command and old battles, and his eyes were a pale, piercing silver that missed nothing. He watched the scene with an unnerving calm, his expression unreadable. Ignoring the daggers in her father's stare, Verity took a slow step forward. The guards raised their spears, warning her back. "Stay away, girl! It's not safe!" But Verity wasn't looking at them. Her gaze was fixed on the terrified animal. She could feel its panic like a physical blow, a frantic, painful pulse in the air. She held out her empty hands, keeping her movements slow, deliberate. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice the same low croon she used to soothe pups frightened by thunderstorms. "Easy, big one. No one is going to hurt you." The hound's snarling faltered. Its ears twitched and its golden eyes fixed on her. The frantic energy coming off it was a storm, but she did not flinch. She took another step and another until she was just beyond the reach of its jaws. She could smell the blood and the fear. She could see the trembling in its powerful limbs. She sank to her knees in the dirt of the courtyard, making herself smaller, less of a threat. She didn't try to touch it. She just stayed there, speaking to it in that same quiet, steady voice, telling it that it was safe, that she understood. She felt a strange warmth spread through her hands, a tingling sensation she'd felt before when tending to a particularly sick or injured animal. Slowly, miraculously, the great hound's defensive posture began to collapse. The savage snarls subsided into a low, guttural whine. Its head lowered. The tension bled from its massive frame, replaced by an exhausted tremor. After a long, heart-stopping moment, the warhound took a hesitant step toward her and laid its huge head in her lap. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Verity gently stroked the hound's head, her fingers finding the frantic pulse in its neck and feeling it slow under her touch. She examined the gash on its flank, her touch light and assessing. It was deep but clean. It was into this stunned silence that her father's voice cracked like a whip. "Verity, get away from that beast and back to your duties." He strode forward, his face mottled with rage and profound embarrassment. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like talons, and hauled her to her feet. "Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty," Lord Valerius said, bowing low before the king, though his grip on Verity's arm never loosened. "My daughter is simple. She is good for nothing but soothing beasts. A worthless girl. The words landed in the cold night air, each one a stone cast at her. Worthless. He had said it in front of everyone, in front of the king. The familiar shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. She expected the king to dismiss her with a flick of his hand, to agree with her father's assessment and turn away. But King Thane did not turn away. He did the opposite. His unnervingly still form moved with a sudden, fluid grace that was utterly silent. He stepped down from the dais, his silver eyes fixed not on her father, but on her. As he drew closer, a strange heat seemed to radiate from him, pushing back the evening chill. And then something extraordinary happened. The king's eyes, that pale, icy silver, began to change. A liquid gold bled into them from the center, swirling with the silver until they glowed with the intensity of molten amber. It was the sign of the wolf, surfacing, looking out through the man's eyes. But this was not a look of anger. It was one of profound, shocking recognition. His gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch, pinning her in place. He wasn't just looking at her. He was looking into her. He inhaled a sharp, deep breath, and his expression shifted, a flicker of something that looked like disbelief, of wonder. His wolf had scented her. It knew her. Thane stopped directly in front of her. He did not acknowledge Lord Valerius, who still had a death grip on Verity's arm. The king's attention was solely, terrifyingly, on her. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them, the air crackling with an energy she couldn't name. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low rumble, like stones grinding together deep in the earth. It held a resonance of absolute command that vibrated through her bones. And it was not directed at her father. It was directed at her. "What is your name?" he asked. She flinched, startled. No one of importance had asked for her name in years. "Verity," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Verity," he repeated, and the way he said it made it sound like a prayer and a verdict all at once. His gaze dropped to her father's hand, still clamped around her arm. A low, almost imperceptible growl rumbled in the king's chest. It was not a human sound. Lord Valerius froze, his eyes widening in alarm. He dropped her arm as if it were a hot coal. Thane's amber eyes lifted back to hers. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently cup the head of the war-hound, Fen, who was still pressed against her legs. The hound leaned into its master's touch, but did not move away from Verity. Its loyalty was now divided. "A man who cannot see the value in this," Thane said, his voice dangerously soft as he gestured from Verity to the calmed hound, "is a fool." His gaze finally shifted to Lord Valerius, and the temperature in the courtyard seemed to drop 10 degrees. The molten amber in his eyes cooled to a merciless, cutting silver. "She is not worthless. She is worth more than your entire bloodline." The insult was so profound, so public, that Lord Valerius paled, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. Her brothers, standing behind him, looked equally stunned. Then the Alpha King did something that shattered every protocol of their world. He went down on one knee before her. It was not the bow of a subject, but the solid, grounded posture of a knight swearing an oath. He took her hand, the one that had soothed his hound, the one her father had bruised, and raised it not to his lips, but pressed it flat against his chest, directly over his heart. Through the rough leather of his tunic, she felt the steady, powerful beat of his heart. She felt the searing heat of his skin, and she felt a jolt a current of pure energy that arced from his body into hers, lighting up every nerve ending. It was a shock of recognition, a feeling of coming home to a place she had never known. "You will be coming with me," he stated, his gaze locking with hers. It was not a request. It was a pronouncement of fact, as absolute as the rising of the sun. He stood, still holding her hand, and turned to face the dumbstruck court. "Lord Valerius," the king said, his voice ringing with an authority that could command armies, "your daughter is now under my protection. She will be given quarters in my own hold. You will pack her belongings. She leaves with my retinue at dawn." Verity's mind was reeling. His hold. The royal fortress of Stonefang? Her? The worthless girl who slept in a cot near the hayloft? It made no sense. She looked from the king's implacable face to her father's slack-jawed horror. For the first time in her life, she saw her father look small. Thane released her hand, though the heat of his touch lingered on her skin like a brand. He turned without another word and strode back into the great hall, his guard falling into step behind him. The great war-hound, Fen, got to its feet and followed him, but not before nudging Verity's hand one last time with its wet nose, a silent gesture of thanks. Verity was left standing in the courtyard, the center of 100 bewildered stares. The silence she had always known was gone, replaced by a storm of whispers. Her father stared at her, not with anger now, but with a dawning, greedy calculation in his eyes. He no longer saw a worthless daughter. He saw a pawn he might use to get closer to the king. But Verity barely noticed him. Her gaze was fixed on the empty doorway through which the king had disappeared. Her hand tingled where he had touched it. Her heart hammered against her ribs with a strange, terrifying rhythm. She didn't understand what had just happened. She didn't know why the most powerful man in the kingdom had singled her out. All she knew was that in the space of a few heartbeats, the Alpha King had seen her. And in his eyes, she had not been worthless. She had been worthy of a king's fealty. The world as she knew it had been fractured, and she had a terrifying feeling that it would never be the same again. The journey to Stonefang Hold was a blur. She was bundled into a covered wagon, a concession to her status that felt utterly foreign. Her father had tried to speak with her, his tone falsely warm, but she had turned away, the years of his cruelty a wall he could not breach. Her brothers had watched her go with expressions of baffled resentment. Stonefang was not a castle. It was a fortress, a titan of gray granite that seemed to grow from the peak of the highest mountain. It was a place of stark, intimidating beauty, its towers scraping a sky that was often the color of slate. It was a reflection of its master, formidable, remote, and unyielding. Verity was led through vast, echoing halls, past grim-faced warriors whose eyes followed her with open curiosity. She was taken not to a guest chamber, but to a suite of rooms in the king's private wing. The rooms were luxurious, with a roaring fire, thick furs on the bed, and a window that looked out over the endless expanse of snow-dusted peaks. It was beautiful, but it felt like a cage, a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. For 2 days, she saw no one but the silent servants who brought her meals. She paced the rooms, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Why was she here? What did the king want from her? Was this some kind of punishment for her father's insolence? On the evening of the 3rd day, the heavy oak door opened. King Thane entered, filling the room with his sheer presence. He had shed his heavy traveling leathers for a simple black tunic and breeches, but it did nothing to diminish his aura of power. The amber glow was gone from his eyes, They were back to that clear, piercing silver. He stood by the fire, watching her, his stillness that of a wolf before the lunge. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. It was Verity who finally broke it, her voice trembling slightly. "Why am I here, Your Majesty?" Thane's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He moved from the fire to the heavy table in the center of the room, gesturing for her to sit. He did not sit himself, but leaned against the table, looking down at her. "My wolf knew you the moment you stepped into the courtyard," he began, his voice a low, intimate rumble that was meant for her ears alone. "Before I did, it recognized your scent." Verity frowned. "My scent? I smell of the kennels." A faint ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No. Beneath that, there is something else. Something ancient. A scent my kind has not encountered in 500 years." He paused, his silver eyes searching her face. "It is the scent of the old blood. The blood of the empaths." She stared at him, uncomprehending. Empaths were the stuff of legends, of stories told to pups in the nursery. They were said to be shifters who could feel the emotions of others, who could soothe the primal rage of the wolf spirit with a touch, a word. They were healers of the soul, and they had been hunted to extinction centuries ago, feared for their power. "That's not possible," she whispered. I can't even shift." "Your power manifests differently," he explained patiently. "It is not in the strength of your wolf, but in the strength of your spirit. It is why the hounds trust you. It is why my war-hound, an animal trained to kill, laid its head in your lap. It felt the calm in you. It felt the safety." He pushed away from the table and began to pace before the fire, his movements restless, charged with a caged energy. "The power of the Alpha King is immense, Verity. It comes with a rage to match it. A primal fire that always burns just beneath the surface. For years I have kept it chained through sheer force of will. But the wars, the burdens of rule, they have stoked that fire. It grows harder to control." He stopped and turned to face her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes, a deep, profound weariness. "When you touched Fen, when I saw what you could do, my wolf recognized its anchor, its calm, its mate." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and unbelievable. Mate. The sacred, unbreakable bond that tied two souls together for eternity. It was a thing of destiny, a bond the wolf chose, not the man. "I don't understand," she said, her head spinning. "Me? Your mate?" "Yes." The word was absolute. "My wolf knew. The moment your father called you worthless, my wolf was ready to tear him apart for daring to insult its mate. The bond is there, Verity. A faint pull for now, but it will grow stronger. I felt it when I touched your hand. Did you not feel it too?" She thought of that jolt, that inexplicable current of energy that had passed between them, the feeling of recognition. She had felt it. "I brought you here to protect you," he continued, his voice softer now. "From your father, who would use you. From my court, who would not understand. And to ask for your help. I need your calm, Verity. I need the gift of your bloodline to help me rule, to keep the beast within me from consuming the man." He was not just a king making a demand. He was a man confessing a weakness to the one person in the world who could be his strength. He offered her a place at his side, but it was a gilded cage built on a bond she didn't understand. Would you have trusted the wolf or fled the king? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. Verity looked at the Alpha King, truly looked at him, and saw past the warrior and the ruler. She saw the immense weight he carried on his shoulders, the lonely battle he fought every day. She, who had always been told she was nothing, was being told she was everything to the most powerful man in the world. She could run. She could demand to be sent back to the familiar misery of her old life. But what would await her? A father who now saw her as a commodity, a life of being used or discarded. Here was a man who saw a power in her she never knew she possessed, a man whose wolf had chosen her. "I will stay," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was the first real choice she had ever made in her life. The relief that washed over Thane's face was so profound, it was like seeing a crack in a mountain. He did not smile, but the harsh lines around his eyes eased. He simply nodded, a gesture of deep, silent gratitude. "Thank you," he murmured, and so began her new life. Days were spent in a strange, quiet rhythm. Thane gave her free rein of the fortress, though two of his personal guard, silent shadows named Kale and Ronan, were never far away. She found her way to the Stonefang kennels, which were larger and grander than her father's, but lacked the same warmth. She spent her hours there, her presence slowly winning over the king's fierce hounds. Thane would often seek her out there. He would not speak, but would stand at the entrance to the kennels, leaning against the massive stone archway, and simply watch her. He watched as she calmed a nervous new pup, as she expertly wrapped a bandage around a hound's injured leg, as she sat in the straw with her arms around the neck of his war-hound Fen, who was now her constant companion. In these moments, she could feel the bond between them, a low, steady hum beneath the surface of her skin. It was a comforting presence, a feeling of being seen, of being known, even in silence. The evenings were spent in his private study. It was a vast, circular room at the top of the highest tower, lined with shelves of old books and maps. A fire always burned in the hearth. Thane would work at his heavy oak desk, poring over reports from his territories, the firelight catching the silver streaks in his dark hair. Verity would sit in a large armchair by the fire, a book in her lap, though she rarely read. Mostly, she watched him. She saw the tension in his shoulders as he read of border skirmishes, the deep frown that creased his brow as he wrestled with matters of state. Sometimes, she would feel a wave of his frustration, a dark, angry pulse from across the room. On those nights, she would rise and go to him. She wouldn't speak. She would simply place a hand on his shoulder. At her touch, she would feel the rigid knot of tension under her palm begin to dissolve. She would feel the angry heat emanating from him cool and recede. He would close his eyes, his head bowing slightly, and lean into her touch with a deep, weary sigh. The great Alpha King, finding a moment of peace. One night, the council meeting had been particularly fraught. A dispute between two hot-headed lords had nearly come to blows in the great hall. Thane had ended it with a roar that had shaken the very stones of the fortress, his wolf so close to the surface that his eyes had burned pure gold. When he came to the study that night, the rage was still clinging to him like a shroud. He paced the room like a caged panther, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He radiated a dangerous energy that made the very air in the room feel thin and sharp. The guards outside the door were tense, their hands on their swords. Verity was not afraid. She felt his rage, yes, but beneath it, she felt the deep, agonizing struggle for control. She saw the man fighting the beast. She went to him, stepping directly into his path. He stopped, looming over her, his breath coming in harsh pants. His amber eyes blazed down at her, unfocused, seeing enemies that were not there. "Thane," she said softly, using his name for the first time. The sound of her voice seemed to cut through the haze. His eyes focused on her, the gold receding slightly, a flicker of silver returning. She reached up, her movements slow and deliberate, and placed her palms on his cheeks. His skin was burning hot. The rage poured off him, a tangible force, but she held her ground, pushing her own calm into him, a gentle wave against a raging sea. "I am here," she whispered. "Breathe with me." He stared at her, his jaw tight, his whole body a cord of violent tension. Then a shudder ran through him. He closed his eyes, and a raw, ragged breath escaped his lips. He leaned his forehead against hers, his sheer size and strength overwhelming. Yet in that moment, he was the one seeking shelter. She felt the storm inside him begin to quiet, the raging fire banking to embers. He stayed like that for a long time, just breathing, his forehead pressed to hers, her hands cradling his face. The heat of his skin subsided. The violent tension bled out of him, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were clear silver again. They were filled with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen before. Awe, gratitude, and a deep, aching tenderness that stole her breath. "Verity," he breathed, his voice rough. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but one of profound, desperate need. It was gentle, searching, a question and an answer all at once. His lips were soft, a startling contrast to the hard lines of his face. He tasted of wood smoke and winter, and a loneliness so deep it made her heart ache. She responded without hesitation, her hand moving from his face to tangle in his thick, dark hair. The bond between them flared, no longer a quiet hum, but a brilliant singing chord that resonated deep in her soul. When he pulled away, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers again, his eyes closed. "You saved me," he whispered, the words a raw confession. "No," she whispered back, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "We save each other." Not everyone at court saw Verity's presence as a blessing. Many of the older, more traditional lords viewed her with suspicion. She was a girl with no title, no wolf, and no powerful family to her name. For her father's name was now tarnished by the king's public rebuke. They saw the king's favor as a sign of weakness, an unnatural enchantment. The most vocal of these was Lord Malik, a grizzled old alpha from the southern valleys, whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty. He had coveted the position of the king's right hand, and he saw Verity as an obstacle. He began to spread whispers in the court that she was a witch, a low-born charlatan who had somehow ensnared the king with dark magic. Thane was aware of the whispers. His response was a cold, dangerous silence that put the entire court on edge. He knew that to act without proof would only give credence to Malik's claims. So he watched, and he waited. Verity felt the animosity like a physical chill whenever she left the king's wing. She saw the way the lords would fall silent when she entered a room, the suspicious glances they would cast her way. The old feelings of worthlessness tried to creep back in, but this time they found no purchase. She was not that girl anymore. She had the king's trust, and she was discovering a strength in herself she never knew she had. The threat, when it came, was not a direct assault. It was subtle, cowardly. Malik found his tool in a disgraced stable hand, a bitter young man with a gambling debt and a grudge. The plan was simple. The man was to loosen the latch on the pen of a particularly aggressive new hound, one not yet accustomed to the stone fang kennels, while Verity was inside. An unfortunate accident. No one would be able to prove otherwise. That afternoon, Verity was in the kennels, humming softly as she brushed Fenn's thick coat. Thane was in a meeting with his war council. She was alone, save for the guards posted at the main entrance. She felt a flicker of unease, a sour spike of fear and malice that was not her own. She looked up, her senses on alert. She saw the stable hand, a man named Yorick, lingering near the far pens. He was trying to look casual, but she could feel the frantic, nervous terror rolling off him, and beneath it, a thread of dark, resentful intent. Her eyes were drawn to the pen he was near. It held a massive, brindle-coated hound that had been brought in only a week ago, a beast with a notoriously foul temper. Yorick's hand moved toward the heavy iron latch on the gate. Verity's blood ran cold. She didn't scream. She didn't panic. Her voice rang out, clear and sharp, with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "Kyle! Ronan! The far pen!" The two guards at the entrance, who had been watching Yorick with suspicion, moved with inhuman speed. They were on him before he could even process the command. He cried out as Ronan twisted his arm behind his back, the iron latch falling from his nerveless fingers and clattering on the stone floor. The door to the kennels burst open. Thane stood there, his council meeting forgotten. He had clearly felt the spike of her alarm through the bond. His eyes took in the scene in an instant. Verity, safe but pale, the terrified stable hand in Ronan's grip, the iron latch on the floor. His face became a mask of cold, lethal fury. The temperature in the room plummeted. He strode forward, each step a promise of violence. He stopped before the whimpering stable hand. "Who sent you?" Thane's voice was terrifyingly quiet. Yorick, trembling, refused to answer. Thane's hand shot out and gripped the man's throat, lifting him effortlessly off the ground. The stable hand's face began to turn purple. "I will not ask again." "Malik!" the man choked out. "Lord Malik!" Thane dropped him. He turned to Kale. "Bring Lord Malik to the Great Hall, now, and summon the entire court." His eyes, burning with a cold, silver fire, met Verity's. "Stay here. You are safe." But Verity shook her head. She walked to his side and took his hand, her small fingers lacing with his. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I will stand with you." He looked down at her, at the fierce, defiant set of her jaw. A flicker of pride, fierce and possessive, burned in his eyes. He squeezed her hand and nodded. Together, they walked to the great hall. The hall was filled with the tense, murmuring crowd of the court. Lord Malik stood before the throne, his face a mask of arrogant denial. When he saw Verity walk in, holding the king's hand, his composure cracked for a moment. Thane did not take his throne. He stood on the floor of the hall, with Verity at his side, creating a clear and unmistakable image. They were a united front. Yorick was dragged forward and thrown at Malik's feet, where he confessed everything in a torrent of terrified words. Malik sneered, "The ravings of a coward. You have no proof, only the word of a stable boy and this kennel girl." "I have all the proof I need," Thane said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "You threatened what is mine. You threatened my mate." A shocked gasp rippled through the hall. He had never publicly named her as such. It was a declaration. a claim. In my kingdom, the Alpha King continued, his voice dropping to a lethal growl, there is only one punishment for threatening the future Luna Queen. He looked at his guards. Take him to the dungeons. He will be stripped of his title and his lands. His bloodline ends with him. Lord Malik's arrogance finally shattered, replaced by disbelief and terror as the guards seized him. You cannot do this! I am an Alpha Lord! You are nothing, Thane said coldly, and with a flick of his hand, Malik was dragged away, his protests lost in the cavernous hall. Thane then turned to face his stunned court. His gaze swept over them, cold and absolute. Let this be a lesson to you all. Verity is my chosen mate. She is your queen. An insult to her is an insult to me. A threat to her is a threat to this kingdom. Anyone who does not understand this will find themselves sharing Malik's fate. His proclamation was met with utter silence. He had not only defended her, he had elevated her, binding her fate to his in front of everyone. A week later, ravens were sent to every corner of the north, summoning the lords to Stonefang for a great council. Among the summoned was Lord Valerius. Verity felt a tremor of old fear at the thought of facing him again, but it was a faint echo now, drowned out by the steady strength she drew from Thane. When her father arrived, he was all smiles and false deference. He tried to speak to her privately, to offer his congratulations, his eyes gleaming with the avarice of a man who sees his fortunes reversed. Verity looked at him, at the man who had called her worthless, and felt nothing but a distant pity. You have nothing to say to me, father, she said, her voice even. You did not see me then. You do not see me now. You see only what you can gain. She turned and walked away, leaving him speechless. The great hall was packed. Every Alpha Lord of the North was present. Thane sat upon the high throne, carved from dark wood and iron. But the seat beside him, the Luna Queen's throne, was empty. Verity stood at the foot of the dais, dressed in a simple gown of deep blue that matched the winter sky. Thane rose. His voice filled the hall, needing no amplification. Lords of the North, I have called you here today to formalize a union, to claim my mate and queen before you all. He looked down at Verity, his silver eyes warm, and held out his hand. She walked up the steps and took it. He did not lead her to the empty throne. Instead, he led her to stand before it, with him. Many of you have questioned my choice, he said, his gaze sweeping the crowd. You see a girl with no great name, no wolf to speak of. You see what is on the surface. You are blind as her own father was. He fixed his gaze on Lord Valerius, who flinched as if struck. You see weakness. I see a strength that can tame the rage of kings. You see a common girl. I see the last daughter of the empath bloodline, a power we thought lost to the ages. A wave of murmurs and astonished whispers spread through the hall. The legendary empaths. It was impossible. Behold your queen, Thane declared. He turned to Verity, his expression softening into one of pure devotion. He took her other hand, holding both of them in his. Verity, my mate, my anchor, my heart. Before my people I claim you. I am yours, now and for all time. He leaned in and kissed her. A slow, tender kiss in front of the entire assembly. It was a seal, a promise, a public declaration of his heart. The bond between them flared into a supernova, a brilliant, unbreakable connection that everyone in the room could feel. When he pulled back, he looked at Lord Valerius. Lord Valerius, you will be the first to kneel before your queen. You will publicly acknowledge the worth you were too blind to see. The humiliation was absolute. Trapped by protocol and the king's unyielding command, Lord Valerius had no choice. He walked forward, his face pale, his movements stiff. He knelt before his own daughter, the daughter he had cast aside. "My queen," he choked out, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I acknowledge your worth." The wound he had inflicted that night in the courtyard, the wound he had deepened over a lifetime of neglect, was finally, irrevocably healed. It was healed not by vengeance, but by truth. She had not needed to prove her worth to him. Thane had simply made him see the truth that had been there all along. Verity looked down at her father, and then at Thane, whose silver eyes were filled with love for her. She was not the kennel-hand anymore. She was Verity, the last empath. She was the mate of the Alpha King. She was the Luna Queen of the North. And she was finally, truly seen. 6 months passed. The snows of winter gave way to the green shoots of a northern spring. Verity had settled into her role as if born to it. She was no longer a silent shadow, but a warm, steady presence at the heart of the court. The lords who had once scorned her now sought her counsel. Her empathy gave her an insight into their disputes that Thane's raw power could not. Together, they were a perfect balance of strength and compassion. Her power had blossomed under the surety of the mate bond. She could feel the emotional state of the entire fortress, a low thrum of contentment and loyalty that she nurtured every day. She had healed the rifts between old rivals and brought a sense of peace to a court long ruled by fear. One evening, she found Thane in the study, a familiar frown on his face as he stared at a map spread across his desk. The weight of his crown was always there, a burden he bore with silent strength. She came up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against his broad back. He instantly relaxed, his hand coming up to cover hers. "Trouble at the southern border?" she murmured. "Always," he rumbled, but the tension had already left his voice. He turned in her embrace and gathered her close, burying his face in her hair. "But it can wait. Nothing is more important than this." She smiled, tilting her head back to look at him. The formidable Alpha King, the wolf of the North, looked at her with an unguarded love that still made her heart skip a beat. "My father called me worthless," she whispered, the memory no longer a source of pain, but a milestone on a long-ago road. "His mistake," Thane murmured, his lips brushing hers. "My greatest treasure." He kissed her, and in his arms, surrounded by the quiet strength of their love, the kennel girl from a forgotten corner of the North knew she was finally home. For more stories where true recognition conquers a lifetime of neglect, and where quiet compassion becomes a queen's greatest strength, subscribe to His Wolf Knew First. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.